Well, Yom Kippur is a day where we consider the possibility of forgiveness because, if you can forgive someone who's wronged you, you've elevated your consciousness. It's not easy to do. I know my brother was born in Charleston, South Carolina, and he never forgave my parents for naming him Irving growing up in the Deep South. But most of the sins are more weighty than that, and we're trying to release ourselves from the captivity of sin, and we're trying to realign with our true values. And what are those values? The rules of how to live, the rules of conduct. They're different for different people. In Hebrew, the word for sin is chet, an arrow that misses the mark. And we know that it's not uncommon for us to miss the mark in our lives when we're trying to achieve something. And we have to allow ourselves the ability to forgive ourselves as well as to forgive others who miss the mark. Tonight we realign and we say that we believe in the possibility of forgiveness, we believe in the power of redemption, and we believe that this holy day can bring about the change we desire in our lives. But we have to know the rules as we seek to restore our integrity. What are the rules? Well, the rules are different in different games. Now, my son played ice hockey for many years, and in ice hockey, hooking is a major penalty. But in polo, it's okay. You can hook. So go know. What are the rules of the road? Well, the rules of the road come to us from a rich repository, the Hebrew Bible, our Torah. That's what gives us the guidance and tells us how to live, what is acceptable behavior and what is unacceptable behavior. And this has been such a tough year for all of us, going through the COVID lockdowns, going through restrictions on what we can do, the wearing of masks, which are, no matter how fine the cotton, are very uncomfortable, especially if you're jogging or trying to exercise with your mask on. But as hard as it is, it's not the hardest thing our nation's ever been through. Look at the year 1930. Now, in 1929, the stock market crashed, and we entered into the Great Recession. And in 1930, the recession continued. The market continued to drop. Banks closed. People lost their homes. 1 in 4 Americans were out of work, unemployed. Life savings were decimated, and people were in a terrible strait. And we think about what followed this COVID for many of us, the fires here in California. Well, there weren't fires, but there were hurricanes, and back then the hurricanes didn't have names. The hurricanes then were just called hurricane. And one hurricane in 1930, and that's the year I'm focusing on, one hurricane in 1930 struck the Dominican Republic with 200-mile-an-hour winds and killed 8,000 people. So that was a tough time. It was a time that a lot of our ancestors, parents and grandparents, lived through that depression. But things were happening then. For those of you who love food, some great stuff happened. Spam made its way onto the market shelves. Kraft brought out macaroni and cheese in 1930. And the Toll House chocolate chip cookie also made its debut. But besides these developments, there were also some really significant innovations that were happening even in the depths of the Depression. Something we all use was invented by 3M engineer Richard Drew, invented Scotch tape in 1930. And the frozen food process was patented by Charles Birdseye in 1930. But 2 significant developments that portended so much for the future of our nation and the advancement of society happened in 1930 as well, in the depths of the Depression. The analog computer was invented by Van Bush at MIT, and the jet engine was invented by Frank Whittle and Dr. Hasbo Ohaim. So these developments would have such an impact on the future of our nation and the development of technology and society. If we think about it, that was a tough year. The Chrysler Building opened that year in Manhattan. And let me tell you something else that happened in 1930. This theater opened its doors September 19th, 1930, 90 years ago this month. It was a vaudeville movie house. That means they had a live show on the stage, dancers, singers, comedians. Then they got out the hook and pulled them off, dropped the screen, and the film that premiered in this very place 90 years ago this month was Charlie Chaplin's City Lights. So imagine, for 5 cents, you could get an escape from everything going on in the crazy world around you. Now, we're lucky we have Netflix. We don't have to come to a live theater, and probably if Governor Newsom has his way, we can't come to the theater for a long time to gather, but not all of us are listening and hanging on every word and declaration out of Sacramento, or for that matter, out of downtown City Hall. But there was a motto. There was a motto that was very popular in 1930. The motto was, use it up, wear it out, make do or do without. Frugality was the order of the day. Make everything you have go longer. Make the best of this situation. We'll come through it as a nation. And we did. And we as a nation will come through this time as well. And we draw upon the rich repository of our faith. I was telling you about the theater. I was always curious about the architect who designed this theater. And his name was S. Charles Lee. He was the most famous architect of the 20s and 30s. He built about 25 theaters around the United States. He designed them. And I tried to find him to speak with him, and I couldn't get him because he died 20 years ago. So I reached his daughter, Connie. And I said, Connie, I'm always curious about names. What did the S stand for in S. Charles Lee? She said, Rabbi, that was a BS name. His name was Simon Levy. He couldn't get work as a young Jewish architect because there was discrimination against Jews. And he changed his name after Robert E. Lee to S. Charles Lee. Simon Levy, the Jewish architect. And you know, there were quotas about the number of Jewish students who would be accepted into medical schools and law schools and even hired as architects and professionals. And we overcame those. And that's why Jewish people recoil against a quota system. Even if the quota system is turned on its head to allegedly give more access for other minorities, we believe in fairness and meritocracy. You deserve that chance, that opportunity, and yes, maybe we can give a leg up and scholarships to those in need, but everyone should achieve based on what they are and who they're achieving, who they're aspiring to be, rather than what the color of their skin or their religious denomination might be. You know, it's ironic that the architect who designed this venue is a vaudeville movie house. It now houses a synagogue, and really a great synagogue, I might add. And we're also a home to other religious denominations that want to express themselves as well. So we ask, where do the values that we aspire to, where do they emanate from? Where do they come from? And we recognize that they come from one of the greatest places, our Torah, our Bible. Now, many of us share with our Christian brothers and sisters great reverence, respect for, and love of the Bible. And as we seek tonight to realign and be in integrity with ourselves, we have to recognize that we, as a people, need to elevate the Torah. A couple of years ago, I was very honored to be asked to be one of 4 rabbis in the United States to join the initial advisory board of the Museum of the Bible. If you've been to Washington, you must visit this museum. 430,000 square feet. It's a stunning museum which explores and celebrates the meaning of the Bible in American society and universally. And it contains both the Torah and the New Testament, and it celebrates the gifts. Now, the Jewish people are less than 0.1% of the world population, but we are 32% of the Nobel laureates. And that speaks to the fact that we love and revere study and education and advancement, and we've given these gifts in the realms of chemistry and physics and medicine, as well as literature and music to the world. But our greatest gift to humanity was the gift of the Torah, the gift of the Bible, the scriptures which guide us, that contain those precious jewels, the golden rule, love your neighbor as yourself, the 10 commandments, and I repeat, not 10 suggestions, 10 commandments, They were commands given to us: not to murder, not to steal, not to lie, to honor your parents. These are values. We don't always live up to them, but they're the standard that we set for human decency and for behavior. And as we talk about realigning with our integrity, that's where these values come from. That's where they emanate from. Our founding fathers were very enamored of the Torah. In fact, all the major universities in the United States after the founding of America, I'm talking about Harvard and Yale and Brown, they all had Hebrew departments. You may ask, Hebrew departments? Yes, the founders wanted to learn Hebrew so they could study the scriptures in their original language. In fact, if you look on the almum of Yale University, you'll see the Hebrew words Urim and Tumim from the Bible, light and perfection. And that was a very intense preoccupation of the founders because, you see, they saw America as the new promised land and its capital as the new Jerusalem. And we have extensive journals which describe this great passionate love of the Bible among the founders. And they wanted America to be so much. Now, of course, there was a flaw. What was that flaw? It was racism. It was slavery that existed in America during its founding. But look what we've done to eclipse that. The abolition movement, the Civil War fought, so much bloodshed. Eventually, the Emancipation Proclamation, the Civil Rights Movement and legislation. And I know that, 8 months ago, we had a magnificent man here speaking at our Shared Heritage Celebration service, Clarence P. Jones, better known as the speechwriter of the late Dr. Martin Luther King. He was quite an accomplished individual. He was the first African American to have a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. And he spoke about the bonds of brotherhood between the African American and Jewish communities. Because many of the founders of the NAACP and other organizations were Jewish. They believed, after all, that this wrong in America's founding needed to be corrected, and it was, over generations. Did we banish everyone who's a bigot and a racist and an anti-Semite? No. But most Americans, the overwhelming majority, don't harbor that hatred in their hearts for Jews or for African Americans or minorities. And so we know that comes also from that great source, the Torah, the Bible, which allows us to realign ourselves with our true purpose, with our real integrity. I love word origins. The etymology of a word is so fascinating. I told you last week on Rosh Hashanah where the word quarantine came from. It's the Italian word quaranta, which means 40. Venice, as many of you know, was a major commercial center. Venice had a powerful navy, and it was a significant port in Europe. And during the Great Plague, the Venetians did not want to allow ships who were unloading cargo to come into their harbor during the plague. So they made them stay outside of the harbor for 40 days. And then eventually, when they determined there was no plague on the ships, they allowed them to come in and unload. There's another word that comes from Venice. Some of you know it. Ghetto comes from Venetian experience. That's where Jewish people were restricted to live only in one area and couldn't leave after sundown. And that idea of restricting people because of their religion or ethnicity or race comes from that experience. But the word integrity, where does that come from? Well, it comes from the Latin word integritas. And integritas comes from the Roman military tradition. When the centurion would review his troops, each one would stand at attention, and he would take his right hand, his fist, and he would pound it over his heart on his armor and say, integritas. Why? To say that his armor was solid, there were no holes, especially over the heart where a thrusting sword or an arrow could cause instant death. Integritas, my shield, my armor is solid. It's not broken, it's not weak. And for us, that relates to our own integrity, that it's solid, it's not weak. And I know that when we talk about being in integrity with ourselves, it's really, really important that we understand that that means taking steps, taking measures that sometimes aren't in our best interest, but enable us to rise to the higher level of who we are and what we want to be. We ask the questions. We ponder. We meditate. We reflect. It's a great story about a question. A rabbi was giving a 2.5-hour sermon. And after the sermon, one of the members of the congregation came up to him and said, "Rabbi, that was a great sermon. I'm the producer of a national newscast, and I think your message is so important, I want to put it on the national news." The rabbi went, "Wow, my sermon, national news. Okay, that sounds pretty good." He said, "But Rabbi, you have to remember, television is a unique media, sound bites. Can you reduce that sermon to 5 minutes?" The rabbi thought, "Oh, wow, 5 minutes. Okay, I can do it." The producer looked at him, so why didn't you? Why didn't you is a very powerful question. Why didn't you is a question we should be asking of ourselves. Why didn't you hold back and not unload on someone who deserved to be unloaded on? Why did you get down in the mud with them? Why didn't you rise above at that moment? Why didn't you take the action for someone, even though it might have jeopardized your financial situation, and make sure they were made whole? Why didn't you? These are the questions we ask. And why didn't you, in a moment of duress, in a moment of danger, step up for others? So the way we come into alignment with our integrity is by asking these questions, by reflecting on who and what we are, and I feel by looking at the examples of people who did remarkable things, because they hold up the best hope for what we can aspire to. And tonight, I've got a special guest who came to us despite the fact that we've got COVID going on, all the way from Tennessee, Pastor Chris Edmonds. And I want to call on Pastor Edmonds to come up, and let's take a moment to look at the story of Pastor Chris's dad, which was so inspirational. And I'll call Pastor Chris up, and let's take a look on our screens at the story of Pastor Chris Edmonds' father, Roddy Edmonds.
You know, my father, he never really talked about his experiences in World War II or his time as a prisoner of war. He would say, "Son, there's some things I'd rather not talk about." So it was kind of a hidden experience in his life.
They segregated the Jewish POWs.
You will order the Jews to step forward, or I will shoot you right now. I wondered, what was Roddy gonna do?
And I said, I got to find out what really happened to my dad during his POW experience.
He never mentioned to his son what he did. Can you imagine? We stood there, we were the witnesses. We were the witnesses.
Welcome, Chris, my new friend, Pastor Chris, here with us from Tennessee. Let's give him a nice warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. It's wonderful to be with you tonight. Shalom, y'all. Can you say shalom, y'all?
Shalom, y'all.
Oh, that is awesome. You are now bona fide, genuine East Tennessee hillbillies. Welcome to the family. So glad to have you. And I want to thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here, and this worship service has been fantastic. I, too, am a servant of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so I bring you greetings from Piney Grove Baptist Church. Love and prayers have been extended to you for the past, really the past year, and particularly with the fires. So we're so grateful to be able to come and share with you. And I'm grateful for this congregation. You are making the change that is needed in this world and in this place, Los Angeles. Because of you, our world is much better and much brighter. Well, my story is really my father's story, and it begins with an old diary, just a weathered, fragile book. The diary belonged to him while he was serving in World War II, fighting for his country on a continent near the edge of collapse. As I said, my father owned the diary, and he just kept that thing tucked away in his dresser drawer over the years and never pulled it out. He served with distinction, and I'm grateful for that. But he served without ever sharing his story. Master Sergeant Roddy Edmonds of the 106th Infantry was captured during the Battle of the Bulge, and he spent 100 harsh days in 2 German prisoner of war camps. And this was the story our family knew. To us, it was the story of him being captured and coming back home. But that's all we knew. Service he never, ever talked about. While reading Dad's diary one evening, and I'd read it several times, but this particular evening, his words really moved my heart. Dad wrote this: "A lot of things I'm not going to write because they're not exactly nice to talk about. I know God was with us, and He answered our prayers. I learned men even better than before. Some were good, some were bad, some were better, and some were worse. And His words and the Spirit of God moved me to look further into His service. And what I discovered was that Dad was the highest-ranking American soldier in Stalag 9A. This was a POW camp for non-commissioned officers, and it was near Ziegenhain, Germany. Now, even in the POW camps, the Nazis had strict anti-Jew policies, and they would segregate Jewish men from the non-Jews, and they would send them to their certain death in concentration camps. As a matter of fact, Jewish soldiers were told by the army if they ever fell into enemy hands that they were to destroy their dog tags and never mention their Jewish identity. So late on the evening of January 26, the Germans made an announcement, and they ordered that only the Jewish Americans were to fall out the following morning. Just the Jews, no one else. Anyone who disobeyed the orders would be shot. Immediately, my dad turned to his men and he said, "We're not doing that. Tomorrow morning, we all fall out." And that's what they did. It was bitterly cold that morning. It was January 27, 1945. As the Nazis gathered, the Americans also gathered. And the Nazi major who had come to that camp to take the Jews away approached. He could not believe his eyes. All the Americans, nearly 1,300 soldiers, stood together as one in sharp formation. Major Ziegman, the major from high command, is stunned. He's in charge of all the POW camps. He's the eyes and ears of Hitler. He's issued the orders. He's there to take the Jews away. No one has ever stood up to him. Well, standing to Dad's left was Sergeant Lester Tannenbaum, a 19-year-old Jewish kid from the Bronx. Dad's friend and one of Dad's best soldiers. On Dad's right is Sergeant Paul Stern, a new friend. He's a combat medic from the 28th Division. He's another Jewish kid from the boroughs of New York. Well, the major is enraged. And so he storms over to my father, gets up in his face, and he screams, "They cannot all be Jews." To which my father declares, "We are all Jews here." Well, the Nazi turned blood red. He was even more enraged. He lunged forward, he pulled his pistol out, and he pressed it hard into my father's forehead. And he screamed, "One last chance, Sergeant. You will order the Jews to step forward, or I will shoot you right now." Well, by this point, Dad and his men had faced untold horrors. Brutal battle, a death march, bombing while locked and imprisoned in boxcars, 40 days of starvation, intentional starvation. Our brave boys and Dad were filthy. They were lice-infested. They were haunted by dysentery. They shuddered because and suffered through the frostbite and the trench foot. And they were forever hungry, as one POW told me, forever cold. My father had been shot, he'd been beaten, he'd been interrogated, he'd been kicked, he'd been smashed with rifle butts, he'd been bitten by dogs. And the only word he would tell me as I grew older and asked about this situation, "Son, we were humiliated." That's all he would say. Before this, just 2 days earlier, he and his men were forced to watch the savage execution of a young Russian soldier, and they were told the same would happen to them if any of them disobeyed orders. Maybe that's why Dad wrote this in his diary. No one can realize the horrors an infantry soldier goes through. You get scared, and I mean scared. Yet there, Dad and his men stood. They stood together, strong, fearless, resolute. As President Obama said, he looked evil in the eye and dared a Nazi to shoot. Well, finally, Dad spoke. And he spoke with the commanding voice that he had his entire life, a voice that he often sang gospel songs with. He said, "Major, you can shoot me, but you'll have to kill all of us because we know who you are." And I can see my dad pointing his finger right in that chest. Because we know who you are. And you will stand for war crimes when we win this war. And you will pay. Lester told me, he said, the major turned white. He blanched. And his arm began to tremble. The arm holding the gun. Still pressing the Luger to my father's forehead. Then suddenly, the major pulled the gun to his side, stuck it in his holster, spun around, and marched back to his quarters, later to leave the camp, and he would never return to ask for the Jewish men again.
That's amazing.
Everyone cheered my father. I guess so. Dad saved the lives of nearly 200 Jewish soldiers that day. 2 months later, Dad would lead a revolt with all of his men, and he would ultimately save all of the men in the camp, and they would self-liberate themselves from being marched out on a death march. And there's so much more I could share with you, and that's detailed in my book called No Surrender, so I hope you'll get a copy of that.
That's the book, No Surrender.
No Surrender. Shameless plug for the book, but anyway, No Surrender.
Pastor Chris,
Yes.
quick question. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
But I interrupt everybody, so don't take personal offense.
Well, I was going to ask if before you became a rabbi, if you were a Southern Baptist pastor.
No, I was not.
You do a really good job.
No, I was not. But,
Okay.
you know, it's good to know there are fallback positions in life.
We'll take you. We'll take you.
Let me ask you, Pastor Chris, how many people are alive today in your estimation as a result of the actions of your father saving those soldiers?
Well, it's not just my estimation. Lester Tanner, he changed his name from Tannenbaum because they sang Christmas carols, and Old Tannenbaum was being sung while he was locked in the boxcar. He said, when I get back home, I'm going to be Tanner. And so he was. But he shared with me one day, he said, Chris, have you calculated the number of lives your father has saved? And I said, well, more than 200 Jewish men, and then I guess the entire camp, almost 1,300 men. He goes, oh, no, it's much more than that. He said there's probably more than 13,000 people alive and well today.
What a mitzvah. Wow.
Because of the men and their families who are living today. And for generations to come.
Yes.
So the song that was sung so beautifully by the precious little girl.
Thankful.
We are the change. Dad was the change in that camp. He made all the difference in the world because it gave the men life. They didn't expect to survive that camp, but they knew that if they followed Dad's leadership because of what he had done for them, they might just survive, and they did. And
his integrity drove him to that statement, to being who he was.
And you know where he got that integrity?
Where?
From the Scriptures.
From the Scriptures. Thank you.
Thank you,
Pastor Chris, for coming all the way from Tennessee to be with us and share that story. So there's another story, and we're going to put on the screen a very interesting letter, and I want to tell you about this story, or have my good friend tell you about the story about his grandpa. And it's another wonderful story of integrity and heroism. And now I'd like to call on my friend Jim Dimitriadis. Jim, please come up. Let's give Jim a nice warm welcome.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
Let's swing the microphone around. There we go.
All right.
So we can hear you.
There we go.
And there's the letter, by the way, on the screens. This is a really interesting letter Jim is going to tell you about.
thrilled to meet all of you and see many of my good friends again. Pastor Chris, thank you for creating a very hard act to follow. That was a fantastic story and very inspirational. And Rabbi Barron, thank you so much for giving me and my family the honor to be here tonight. I'd heard about this. I'd heard about this letter. But my father, who died 2 years ago this month, hadn't really ever talked too much about it, just mentioning that it was there. And so when he passed, my wife was going through his papers, thank God, and Nancy found this letter. So we were excited. We were ecstatic. I mean, we had heard about this, and we read it. And I said, this must be the letter. And she goes, Jim, you've got to do something with this. And so who can we share this with? And so we thought of our good friends, Bert Sugarman and Mary Hart. And I took a picture of it on my phone, and I sent this over to him. Bert, look at this letter that we found from my grandfather in my father's papers. And he goes, Jim, do you realize what this is? Right away, I got a phone call. He goes, you must share this with the Wiesenthal, and they must do some research and understand what happened. And so thus began a journey where we took this document to the Wiesenthal, and they actually got in touch with a researcher in Greece who was specialized in researching the Jewish people in the area of Greece. And she went to all of these families and was able to learn from them the story of these families. So it turns out that because my father's family, my grandfather, had been fairly well-to-do, they had a very large house in Athens. Well, the Nazis would billet officers in the nice houses. So they actually had a Nazi officer living in their house for the duration of the war. But my grandfather also was, of course, a kind and generous man, as we have heard. And he would say that relatives were coming to stay. And these were the Jewish families that you see on TV, on this screen. Family after family, under different circumstances and using different excuses, came and stayed in his house with his wife and 3 children while there was a German officer staying in that home. The results of finding out such a thing was instant execution of not just he, but his entire family. God was with him. God was with him. And he lived to be an old man of 80 years old, which is amazing considering he was born in 1893. And his children all were educated and have done amazing things with their own families. And I like to think that the blessings that my family has had is a direct result of the great things that he did.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you. That's an amazing story of heroism. And I want everyone to know that these are actions that were taken by people, but sometimes it doesn't have to be on the grand scale of risking your life and your family's life saving. Sometimes you align with your integrity by the little things you do. And I'll tell you a quick story to end tonight of Dr. Paul Natterson, who's a very prominent cardiologist here in Los Angeles. I performed Paul's wedding to Kira, who's a well-known pediatrician. And Paul was attending to a wonderful man, Max Ramberg, who was dying. And this happened right in the heart of the COVID epidemic as it was just gaining momentum. And Max was dying, but because of COVID regulations, his children could not come to his bedside to say goodbye. It was heartbreaking. Imagine not being able to say goodbye to your mom or dad as they're dying. And what Dr. Natterson did is he got into the room, he put his iPhone on FaceTime, and he allowed each of the children to say goodbye to their dad. And it's little actions as well as the grand actions, as well as the super heroic actions that make us the people who we are. It comes from a place of integrity based on a system of beliefs that urge us to be better and better as human beings, to correct and make right our sins and wrongdoings before God and before each other. And I hope we take those messages to heart, because those exemplars of heroism give us hope for the future, for the next generation. Amen.